So let's get started here. To everybody just joining, once again, I'm Reagan Kinney of TBK Creative, and welcome to Web Accessibility and the Law, a webinar presented by TBK Creative and sponsored by AODA Online. Now, your presenters today you may have heard a little bit about. We will be having Andrew Schiestel and Andre Lafort joining us. Andrew Schiestel is the president at TBK Creative and AODA Online. Now, Andrew is a 5-time international award-winning digital marketer, an award-winning entrepreneur, and a columnist with the London Free Press. In 2013, Business London magazine named Andrew to their 20 under 40 list, which recognizes industry leaders under the age of 40 who give back to their community. Andrew speaks and consults across Ontario on how companies can build web that sources their brand's greatness while meeting the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. So joining Andrew today is our own Andre Lafort, the VP of Technology at TBK Creative and AODA Online. Andre graduated from Western University with his software engineering degree, and he has over 15 years of professional software development experience. Previous to joining TBK Creative, actually, Andre worked as a senior developer at 3M Canada for 7 years, where he worked on large projects, such as the development of the company's current international B2B e-commerce website. So welcome, Andrew and Andre. I believe we have you both on the line. Hello, guys.
Yeah. Hi, Reagan. Thank you for that kind introduction. And hello, everybody. Just to make sure that everybody can hear Andre and I okay, can you take a moment and go into your GoToWebinar control panel and go to the chat and say hello, and that way we just know that everybody can hear us okay.
We do have a few hellos that came in right at the beginning there, so it looks like, oh,
okay, great, yeah, cool. And so as Reagan said, everybody, throughout any questions that you have, there is going to be a Q&A period at the end. So the best thing to do is if something's burning and you feel it might not get addressed, put it in that put it in the questions box. We had over 100 registrations for this event, so I'm not sure if we're going to get to every question, but your questions are going to be read, and we're going to try to get to as many questions as possible at the end. And we have a lot of material to cover as well, so some stuff that you're thinking about may get covered. But it is an open forum in that respect, and we really do want to know what's on your mind, and we are really here to help you understand web accessibility and more about your obligations under the AODA. Okay. A little bit of direction for the conversation today, everybody. This is the table of contents. We're going to be covering some of the challenges that people have when using the web. Assistive technologies that are popular that people with certain physical disabilities use regularly to access content. Andre is going to provide an introduction to WCAG, the what and why behind it. I'm going to cover more about the Accessibility for Frontarians with Disabilities Act and your obligations under that legislation as it pertains to the web. Andre is going to cover more some specific WCAG 2.0 level A guidelines for HTML for your web. And I'm going to do an introduction for everybody on document accessibilities, specifically PDF. And then we're going to take an opportunity to answer some of your questions. AODA Online is a sponsor of the event, so I want to take 45 seconds before we dive into the content and shine a spotlight on this software. It's an enterprise-level web accessibility and monitoring software that's used by a lot of Ontario groups. Large private sector and public sector groups across Ontario use the software. It's helpful for web development teams because what it does is it will monitor your website. And what AODA Online does is it crawls your site like Google crawls your site, but AODA Online is crawling your site, finding known WCAG 2.0 errors, and some of which we're going to be speaking about later on. But it's finding those errors for your web development team to save a lot of time. It's pointing out where they are, and it's providing remediation and repair techniques so that you can correct those errors on your website. And it can monitor 500, 50,000, 500,000 plus enterprise level website. So that's kind of the why and the usefulness behind it, and that's why a lot of organizations are subscribing to AODA Online to save their team a lot of time with web accessibility and to make websites more accessible. And you can see there it specifies specific guidelines that are being contravened, allows dismiss and rescanning and scheduling features for long-term WCAG 2.0 and AODA compliance. After the call, if you want more information on AODA Online, you can activate a free 25-page scan at AODAOnline.com right on that website. And you can also book a demo if you want to actually have a walkthrough on how the software works and if it would be useful for your organization. So thank you for allowing me to take a couple moments to share AODA Online with you in your organization. So let's dive into some content here. We're going to start with a background on the Accessibility Frontarians with Disabilities Act. It's provincial legislation here in Ontario. It was passed in 2005. It's now regulated by the Ministry of Economic Development. It requires, like the essence behind it is it requires businesses to become more accessible for people with physical disabilities. There is a commitment by the ministry that Ontario is accessible by 2025. And so this legislation is a real means to that goal. There's 5 main sections to kind of compartmentalize the legislation down. There's customer service, so making new policies and ways businesses act around customer service. Employment is another pillar of the legislation. Information technology, transportation, and built environment. Those are the 5 pillars. The legislation actually applies to every corporation with more than 1 employee in Ontario. A lot of people don't realize that, but it actually is every group. The degree of requirements and reporting changes based on the size, but every corporation with more than 1 employee in Ontario does fall under the AODA. Section 14, so when you're doing your own homework and learning more about web accessibility and your obligations, Section 14 of the AODA is what applies to the web and in making websites and web content more accessible for people with physical disabilities, providing the means for people with certain disabilities, an ability to access content the same way that somebody without that disability can access that content. That's the real intent behind that. And I'll pass it to Andre to do an introduction into some of the challenges that we find people with certain physical disabilities have when using websites. Andre.
Thank you, Andrew. So the fact is that 1 in 7 Ontarians has a disability of some sort. The next few slides will cover 3 broad topics, each pertaining to specific impairments. The first I'd like to cover is a visual impairment. And the question here is, with a visual impairment, how will you navigate the web? Depending on the severity of your impairment, you'd likely want to use what's called a screen reader. Now, what a screen reader is an assistive technology which is employed to read out loud in spoken word the content that is presented on a website. So what we have on this slide here are logos for a few of the most popular options, JAWS for Windows, NVDA, Window Eyes, and the Mac VoiceOver tool as well. Moving on, there is another impairment that we must be aware of, and that is someone who has a hearing impairment. So the question becomes, if you have content on a website that is media, so consider video or presentation with narration, how does someone with a hearing impairment get to hear the content or understand the content that's spoken within this video? Well, the answer is pretty simple in this case. We provide either open or closed captioning. And the next slide presents a YouTube screenshot. And on it, you can see this is a video. And at the bottom, there's the open captioning, which translates the narrated speech to text so someone can read it instead of hearing it. Now, the third and final impairment that I like to cover is motor impairment. And motor impairment, like the previous two types, can vary widely. Someone who has limited mobility in their hand may not be able to use a mouse. So in that case, they'd rely on a keyboard to navigate websites. If beyond that, they're not able to make use of their hands, they are able to use what's called a pointing device and use it as a head mouse. In this case, the actions are actually performed by the user by way of moving their neck. And so by being aware that this is what the web is like for certain people, it better prepares us to really get grounded in why it's important to make web accessible. Yeah. So this is an example of some other assistive technologies that are available to folks. Again, the screen reader, which speaks the content of the web. And then a Braille reader, which actually will transform the content on the website into tactile feedback for someone to use their fingers to read. So someone who would be deaf and blind would definitely be using a Braille reader. And so that segues perfectly into what's called the WCAG 2.0. And so the AODA actually states that websites must be accessible and must comply with the guidelines as they are set forward in the WCAG 2.0. So the WCAG 2.0 is a set of guidelines that was built by the W3C, which is the World Wide Web Consortium. And the purpose of these guidelines is to set out some rules within certain areas and to provide these very broad approaches to making technologies, so a technology like HTML or various documents, to make them accessible. And within those technologies, there are also techniques that we can employ to make that content accessible.
Yeah, so maybe and we've had this conversation before on how everybody understood WCAG 2.0's role better myself, was looking at it like WCAG 2.0 is a set of principles in which you can then apply technologies on top of, such as HTML or PDFs.
Absolutely.
And then by applying the appropriate principles, because not every principle applies to every technology, but by applying appropriate principles, that document becomes more accessible to somebody with a physical disability, or if they're using an assistive technology like a Braille reader.
Exactly. And so the WCAG was put together essentially to ensure that websites are capable of communicating with these assistive technologies, which is a really important distinction to make, because as websites are designed for visual mediums, so a web browser or folks without impairments, it's important for us to ensure that the website's also developed in a way that allows these assistive technologies to understand them.
Yeah.
And the WCAG 2.0 provides that structure for us.
Yeah, and I think the challenge that we've all been able to see now is that 5-10 years ago, probably largely because there wasn't legislation, just a lot of website development wasn't practicing all of the WCAG 2.0. It wasn't really a priority to many web development firms. And so if that continues, where that leaves people then is if they're using a screen reader, that screen reader may not be able to fully communicate with the website that they're on. So the information that they're trying to receive, such as information about their phone bill, for instance, they may not actually be able to receive that information if their assistive technology can't communicate well with that website. Exactly. And I think that's probably the premise behind why the WCAG 2.0 exists.
Exactly. Yeah. If we move on to the next slide at this point.
Yeah. So the relationship, everybody, at a basic level behind AODA and WCAG, because we're talking about two, very different bodies of text here. One is you can really say legislative here in Ontario, and the other one is somewhat of a governance, but it's more recommendations for best practices. The relationship between the two is that you have legislation called the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, and then within the Act, in Section 14, whenever it's referencing certain requirements, it points, I think, every time to WCAG 2.0.
It does.
Yeah. So if anybody's wondering why we are bringing up kind of WCAG 2.0 inside of an AODA conversation, is because the Act itself points to that universal body that was created by the W3C, the Worldwide Consortium for Best Practices for developers to build technologies like HTML that's accessible for people with physical disabilities. So I wanted to share that background before we get into this FAQ here in a moment, so you understand better the relationship. So in the next couple minutes, we're going to go through 9 or 10 frequently asked questions, things that we've learned over time on how on organizations' obligations under the AODA, and I want to share those with you now. Some notes before we begin. This section applies to public, not-for-profit, and private sector groups with employees in Ontario. All answers have been verified by the Accessibility Directorate of Ontario. That's short for ADO, and they go by Access ON to the public. And this section is for education only purposes and not to be taken as legal advice. So of course, when making big decisions, do your due diligence. Let's get into these popular questions. Question 1, a popular question: am I obligated, and when? So section 14.4 is where you'd want to guide your research. And what it basically says is, if you're public sector, and this whole section pertains to groups with employees in Ontario, so if you're public sector or a large organization, and that's question 2, a large organization has over 50 employees in Ontario, so if you're one of those two, you shall meet the requirements set forth in this section. And so the first part of this subsection is that by Jan 1, 2014, when you're building a new internet website and web content on that site, it must conform to WCAG 2.0 Level A. By January 2020, or by January 1, 2021, all internet sites, if you're an obligated organization, so again, the public sector or that large group, by 2021, your website, whether it's new or not, must meet WCAG 2.0 Level 2A. There's another section that people overlook a lot because it's further down in this section, but it's a very important line in section 14, and it's 14.5b. When you're required to have your website meet the appropriate level of WCAG 2.0, whether you're building a site now and it needs to meet Level A, or by 2021 it needs to meet AA, the content, any content on that site that's published after Jan 1, 2012, also has to meet the appropriate level of WCAG 2.0 at that time. So an example, so if you're building a new website in 2015, that website has to meet Level A, which would be 14.4.1 on the screen. And any content that you published on that site after Jan 1, 2012 also needs to meet Level A. So, and that may sound kind of odd, like how that's said, but there's times that groups will, if you have a lot of subpages, you'll migrate a lot of content over. You'll reuse certain pages for content. Yep. And so that's where that would apply. You have to ensure that web content still meets that appropriate level of WCAG 2.0. So that's question 1. Question 2 that we're asked a lot is, what is a large organization? Large organizations means an obligated organization with 50 or more employees in Ontario. So to clarify this one, all public sector, the public sector is not within this question because it's treated as its own. It's just public sector, it's any size. Large organizations are organizations with over 50 employees in Ontario. That could be private sector or not-for-profit. Another question. What if my company is based outside of Ontario, but we have over 50 employees working in Ontario? According to the ADO, your company would still be an obligated organization under the AODA. Question 4. What's a new internet website? And this is copy and pasted from the legislation. A new internet website means either a website with a new domain name or a website with an existing domain name undergoing a significant refresh. It's a great segue for question 5. What is a significant refresh? There's a really good website within the ministry's webpage that's listed there, and it speaks more about organizations' obligations under the AODA for web. And so we copy and pasted these 3 bullet points here as they define it. So this is copy and pasted from the ministry website, and how they define it is this: a new look and feel to the website, a change in how users navigate around it, and or a major update and change to the content of the website. In a conversation with the ADO to clarify what a significant refresh is for everybody, what I was told over the phone was that there is no quantifiable way to know what a significant refresh is. A good rule of thumb is 50%. That's the recommendation that I received. Question 6. How does my company's intranet apply? So this would be probably a password protected area of some sort that's for staff only, as an example of an intranet. For public and large organizations, the intranet doesn't apply. Government has some obligations under Section 14, but public sector and large organizations do not. Question 7, how does my company's customer portal apply? Again, password protected areas such as online banking or a student portal, that's password protected. It's a great question. According to the ADO, it doesn't apply for public sector and large organizations. According to the ADO, password protected customer portals are considered an extranet and not an internet website. Question 8. I have a third-party feed on my website, but it's not WCAG 2.0 accessible. Am I contravening the Act? Great question. In many cases, you're not. And I'm going to use the example of Twitter. I think that's a good example. A lot of websites nowadays have a Twitter feed. And I don't know if Twitter is meeting WCAG 2.0 or not. We just have not done an audit on Twitter, but I'm going to use them as an example. So according to 14.5b, this section applies to websites and web content. So if we're thinking about the Twitter example, you have a Twitter feed. It would be web content. So you would think it applies. It is a web-based application. It's being pulled into your website as an app. But you don't control it directly. Now, there is a contractual relationship you have with Twitter. You will be under some form of terms by using it. But the terms probably don't allow for the modification of the product. So in that case, that third-party feed, an argument could be made that it does not apply. I hope that's helpful for everybody because that's a common question. What penalties and fines can exist? The Access ON, the ADO, has made it very clear in their communications that they want to work with organizations across Ontario and help them meet the regulations of AODA so we can all achieve an accessible Ontario by 2025. With that said, the director of the ADO, at her discretion, has the authority to issue penalties for noncompliance. And these can include $200 to $2,000 for an individual or unincorporated organization, $500 to $15,000 for corporations, and daily amounts can apply in the most serious cases. At any point in time, if you have your own questions for the ADO to understand your obligations better under the AODA, you can also directly contact Access ON. And so we provided you this toll-free phone number here and their website. I hope those frequently asked questions in some of the answers is helpful in understanding your obligations more under this legislation.
Mm-hmm. Even for someone like myself, it's always nice to see them again.
Yeah.
So next, we'd like to jump into some examples to demonstrate how the WCAG 2.0 guidelines can be applied for a technology like HTML websites. Now, did we have the...
Yeah, it would be on Chrome.
Okay, we have to open them up. Please bear with me here for a few seconds as I set things up. Okay, so the first example I'd like to cover is the very first guideline in the set. There are 25 guidelines in the WCAG 2.0 Level A set. The very first deals with providing information via text for non-text content. Put in another way, it is, in one example, it is images must have metadata associated to it so that screen readers and braille readers can know what information is conveyed in that image. So I'd like to showcase an example here on the 3M Canada website. There is an area here that features a brand. And within this area is an image of 3 Scotch-Brite products. And as I mouse over it, you can see that there is a title that pops up, and it says 3M featured brand application image, which indicates to me that it's a featured product, but doesn't tell me what the product is. So in this case, it complies with one part of this guideline that states all images must have an alternative text, which is that title. But part of this guideline also states that the description of that image must be accurate and convey the same purpose and information as the image. So in other ways, I would simply just retitle the image description here, and I'd say something like image featuring Scotch-Brite Ultra products, stainless steel, granite, and stovetop cleaners. And in that way, that same information can be conveyed to someone who's using a screen reader, so via spoken word, or even a braille reader, so via tactile responses. Okay. Now the next one I'd like to cover is on the NHL website. I'll have to pause this briefly as it starts playing. Okay, so the idea here is we have a multimedia. So we have a multimedia video on the webpage, and it is the main piece of content on this website. In this case, Guideline 1.2.2 says that for any pre-recorded synchronized media, and synchronized media means when an audio and video feed are combined to create what we consider, video, television, advertising. We must provide captions for folks who are hard of hearing. So in this case here, I would typically look in the settings panel in order to turn on captions, but we can notice that captions aren't available for this video player on the NHL website. That's a problem for someone who can't hear, because there's likely going to be a narrator telling me about the hockey play, the players involved, and the outcome, but I won't be able to understand that. Now, the simple solution is to include a video player on the website that provides captions. Earlier in the presentation, we showcased what it looked like on the YouTube video player to have captions. So I'd recommend something very similar to that. Now, the next example I'd like to cover involves the Microsoft.com main website. Lovely website. And as someone who's viewing the website through a web browser, I can tell that it's in the English language. And that is also important for screen readers to know what the language of the website is and how to convey the spoken version of it to the viewer. So guideline 3.1.1 says that when you have an HTML content, you must specify the language that the website is written in for that exact purpose, so that screen readers and other assistive technologies can understand that. So what you would want to do is verify that the website does in fact have that HTML language attribute within it so that a screen reader can understand it. So by inspecting the website here, we're just going to head up to the top. You'll notice that there's a fancy HTML element at the very top here. And what we're looking for here is an attribute on it that says lang equals, and then in this case, it would be en. That's the default. Every website must have the lang attribute. And in specific cases, there's also the inclusion of the XML language attribute. So in this case, unfortunately, the Microsoft website does not convey the language that the website's written in to a screen reader, and would present a challenge to someone reading it with a screen reader. And lastly, I'd like to highlight two more guidelines on one website. This is the Microsoft Outlook login page. The first guideline I'd like to talk about is the guideline 1.3.1, and it deals with presenting relationships and information for elements on a website in a manner that assistive technologies can understand. So when looking at this login form, it can be assumed, and it's pretty obvious to someone using a web browser, that the first field is for your username or your email address in this case, and the second field in this form is for your password. But it's also important to make sure that this relationship between what these fields are for can also be understood by assistive technology. So in this case, software. So in order to verify that, we'll want to inspect the element. And one of the ways that you can infer the purpose of this field is by including a label element along with the input. So what I would be doing right now is reviewing to make sure that the input element actually has a label element. And in this case, it doesn't. So what would happen in this case is a screen reader would be unable to provide the purpose of this field to someone who is viewing the website. And the same for someone using a Braille reader. They would simply know that it's an input field. It may have a name, but it may not be very descriptive or very useful. So I would recommend placing a label element, and in it you would be able to say, please type in your username or password in this case. And lastly, I'd like to review guideline 1.4.1, which speaks to the use of color. Color is very important when designing a website. It's very important in providing context and content, but it must also not be the only way that you provide that context or information to a user. And why that's important is because many folks who have visual impairments, which can range from color blindness to visual issues for someone who's aging, or even someone who is blind. And in this case, we'll focus on someone who's colorblind. If you're colorblind and unable to discern between very similar shades of a color or very similar colors, certain actions on a website won't be very obvious to you. So I'd like to bring attention to the two links that are found beneath the form here. One's titled "Can't Access Your Account," and the other is "Sign in with a single use code." And what happens when I mouse over? I'm not sure if you'll be able to see on on your end. But when you mouse over, the font color changes just ever so slightly to a lighter blue, which for myself is hard to see. But I would imagine someone who has a visual impairment might have an even more challenging time. So the idea here is that by only using color, chances are I'm not able to discern that there's actually an action that I can perform here. So my recommendation is when you're providing, in this case, when you have links to content, ensure that you have another means of conveying that information. So maybe underline your links, make them bold when I mouse over them, make them italicized. Just do something that is not specifically color-based so that someone who is colorblind can still discern that there's an action to be taken here.
Very good.
Yeah.
Okay. So that concludes some examples of how WCAG 2.0 can be applied to HTML. What I'm going to do now is provide an introduction into PDF accessibility for everybody, consistent with WCAG 2.0. And so we're going to hop off our PowerPoint again, and we're going to go into Adobe Acrobat Professional. And before I do so, I'm going to just give a little background on what accessible PDFs are. So when you hear accessible PDFs, what that normally means is tagging a document. And so we're going to show you how to do that in a moment in a basic example. And what tagging allows for is it provides a hidden textual elements that someone visually can't see in a PDF, but assistive technology like a screen reader can. So it allows for that assistive technology to communicate more with the PDF to provide more information to a reader in this scenario, someone with a visual impairment who's going to rely more on audio. Other elements that you want to think about when it comes to making PDFs accessible is also color contrast. So creating an adequate amount of difference in color between a font color and its background. And another element that you want to think about when it comes to PDF accessibility is also font sizes, making sure your fonts are large enough, which becomes a AA guideline.
It does.
All right, so let's go into a document here. We'll use a sample PDF. So as I'm opening this, some more background on why Adobe. So most popular user agents out there, such as Word, Microsoft Word, and InDesign, have ways to make a document that you're creating more accessible in the document. There are different ways, and look at those as different technologies, and they can follow principles within WCAG 2.0 that are applicable to them. When it's time, there's probably a lot of corporate communicators on the call. You might be tasked with PDF accessibility within your organization. So what happens a lot is PDF is a very popular type of document out there because oftentimes Word documents will be PDF'd, quote unquote. You can turn design files into PDF documents. So when it comes to learning about document accessibility, learning more about PDF is a very good place to start. And then you can work out from there. So that's a little more background on PDF document accessibility to begin with. Adobe Acrobat Professional is the type of software you want to use when you're creating accessible PDFs. We recommend version 11 to be used. The on-screen, the software that we're using, the Adobe Acrobat Professional version is 11. You can get away certainly with version 10, and you can also get away with 7, 8, and 9. It's just that version 11 is the most recent and has the most accessibility features for users like you and I. Okay, so we're in now. So we're in Adobe Acrobat. And one more distinction I'm going to create is that a lot of us have Adobe Reader. Reader is useful for reading a document, whereas Acrobat simply provides you more features, as you're about to see, to be able to modify, to be able to edit a document. So that's the purpose for Acrobat Professional, to be used in this scenario. All right, so you're looking at a PDF, a single page PDF. It's a sample document, and you are tasked with making this document accessible because you have a company picnic coming up and you want people to show up for it. So, and you may have a policy within your organization that documents are accessible, or ethically, you just want to make sure that documents are accessible that are going out, because you have certain employees that have a visual impairment and may rely on assistive technology like a screen reader. So here's a tutorial I'm going to provide for everybody on how to make this document accessible. Within Adobe Acrobat Professional, you want to first access the accessibility portion of Acrobat Professional, and it's under Tools. And you will see, if you're opening it up for the first time, you may not see a button here called Accessibility. I believe it's not there by default. So if you're loading yours for the first time and you don't see it, what you do is you go to View, Tools, and then you press Accessibility, and that will activate it within Tools for you. So this is sort of your command center, if you will, or your control panel when it comes to accessibility features. Okay, so now let's go through the process of adding some tags to this document. The next step here is you want to click Add Tags to Document. And this is a feature that basically Acrobat Professional will do the first go at it for you, provide some extra information here. We don't have to go through that right now. But what has quickly happened there by pressing that button is Acrobat Professional has tagged the document. And here's how we can see the tags. There is a button here on the right column called Touch Up Reading Order. Press it. Can everybody see that now? This is how you see the hidden elements that you and I, if we were to look at this as a reader, wouldn't see, but an assistive technology like a screen reader would communicate with. So now, because I hit this Add Tags to Document, Adobe Acrobat has done its best to provide elements here. We don't have to necessarily follow these recommendations. So I'm going to tag this document up in a way that I would probably do it in creating this document. So you can click this button, Clear Page Structure, click Yes, and we've removed them all. And now what we can do here, I'm going to start tagging some documents or some elements here with my cursor. So I found the logo. A figure caption within Adobe is very similar to what you would know as an image tag and an alt tag, an alt attribute within HTML. Mm-hmm. It's just different terminology, but it has really the same, for the most part, same function and meaning. So you click this, and you can see now how it's been tagged as a figure caption. I can right-click on the caption, and I can edit the alternative text, and I would call this something like ABC Company, and press OK.
And actually, this is a fantastic example of how the guidelines in the WCAG can apply to different technologies. So the first example I showcased, it was exactly the same thing here.
Yeah.
But you're showing the same technique in a different technology.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Yeah, so if everyone remembers, the first example that Andre showed on the web was 1.1.1, I believe.
Correct.
Which is providing non-text content
with text
content.
Yeah.
And so Andre demonstrated that, and now we're actually in a PDF document. It's actually the same guideline applies.
It is.
Yeah. Thanks for pointing that out.
You're welcome.
So let's go on here and tag more of this document. So now there's a heading. So I would call this heading 1, and you can actually see H1, very similar to your HTML counterpart. There's an image here. I would say this image could be certainly something you want to create an alt attribute for alternative text for, depending on if it's relevant to the user. This might be if this was, for example, last year's picnic, and there's some employees here playing volleyball off to the side. So let's caption that, because that might show excitement and may motivate somebody to want to attend this year if they like volleyball. So I would note in the alternative text here, employees playing volleyball at last year's picnic. Done. We can create this here. I've just highlighted these 3 paragraphs, and you can make that text. We can do the same here. So we're tagging it. These aren't necessary because this is what would be considered decorative images. So if something doesn't really advance the communications, doesn't really add any more meaning or purpose to a document, it's a recommendation not to create alternative text for it, because it could actually slow down the communications for a reader using a screen reader if they had to listen in audio format every decorative image that's there. So we can actually click background here. And then there's some other information here that we can choose as text. More text. And text. Okay. And I'm going to close this down. So we're seeing it without tags. And if I want to see it with tags again, they're still there. Screen readers, most screen readers can also read the document in a particular order, and we can support the user in that particular order. So there's another feature here I want to make you aware of called Show Order Panel. So you click that, and you can see here, and if you click Page Content Order, watch what happens. We're going to watch the tag labels. If I just press this button, it switches to numbers. And this can be a possible order that a screen reader will read this content in. If we feel like there's other pieces of content here that should be prioritized, let's say above this picture, possibly the date would be more important to the reader, date, time, and location. If you want that message to be conveyed, you can take it and you can actually pull it up into that and drop it, and then the numbers will change. So that's how you rechange the order of your tags. So I'm going to close this down. I'm going to show everybody one last important feature here to complete tagging a document and making it accessible. There's a really good tool within version 11 called Action Wizard. So if you click that button here in the right pane, you can click Make Accessible. And you can see here there's actually 3 major steps and multiple sub steps that you go through, and it's an accessibility review. So let's start. So it's going through the process here, and it's prompting me for information. So it's asking for a title. So I would say something like ABC Company Picnic Invitation Document. You could probably even leave off document. Subject. Author. Or the author could be, or it could be your company. And keywords. Okay. Prompts me now for some more information. For the most part, you'll be pressing OK to these. As you know, PDFs can get sophisticated. You can make PDFs to have forms, and you can make forms accessible using some of the elements that we went through here. So in this case, there's no form to be filled out. So we can either say yes to detect form fields or no to skip this step. In this case, neither will matter because there is no forms. We set the language. As Andre pointed out earlier, that's an important element because a screen reader will oftentimes want to know what language the content is based in. It's going to see now if we missed any figures being images. So let's say OK and see what happens. There are no figures that were missed with alternative text. And the last thing it does is it runs an accessibility checker. And look at that, it passed. The question marks is logical reading order with this, it needs a manual check. And color contrast needs a manual check. But other than that, what you're looking for is you want check marks. Anything that has an X, a red X, that's what you then want to investigate a little bit further. Okay. And then you'd save up, and you now have an accessible PDF. Oops, it started from the start. Let me get back to the chart here for everybody. We're done now the demonstration of HTML accessibility with some guidelines and an introduction to PDF accessibility. But before I complete that, I want to show everybody this chart because if you're learning PDF accessibility for the first time, I find a chart like this helpful to show the difference between PDF and HTML. So you can see that there's a lot of similarities. So if you're a web developer on the call, you'll be nodding your head saying, yeah, totally, I totally see and get that. So you can see forms are very similar. Both PDF and HTML use heading tags. Images in PDF is called a figure, whereas in HTML they're called an image. Within a PDF, again, images are figures, and then captions is the description. In HTML, it's image and alt text. And then we have tables are identical. And then when it comes to the non-important images, like decorative images, in PDF, they call it a background image. And in HTML, the best practice is actually to still create an alt tag. All images should have an alternative text within HTML, but if it's decorative, you don't put any content between the quotations. And that's so that a screen reader actually knows.
To ignore it.
Yeah, it's decorative on purpose.
Yep.
All right, so we've gone through the challenges that people have using the web, a little bit more information on that. Popular assistive technologies, Andre gave an introduction to WCAG 2.0 for everybody. We spoke about some really important and hot questions that we get asked a lot regarding AODA and organizations' obligations under the legislation. Andre spoke about those guidelines under WCAG 2.0 for HTML, and I provided an introduction to PDF.